So I'm really pleased to be able to talk about this topic. And I'd like to just clarify about the basic heading on the topic and the words used, because you've mentioned epistemological relativism, which would mean, of course, things to do with knowledge, and relativistic meaning perhaps having multiple standpoints upon that knowledge or multiple standpoints of knowing. But the phrase that I'm going to use is epistemic relativism. And the difference is about the episteme being the sort of fount of all knowledge, or any foundation or grounding of knowledge. That sometimes is called an episteme, which is a really challenging word for most people. And epistemological as well, being the study of that knowledge. It's quite a challenging word, but I hope as we go along, it'll become easier to see how to use these words or how to really take up the issues. So I'm going to do it in the question and answer format in the beginning of my talk. And the question and answer format would be actually based on a book I've written for students called Data Collection. You know, it's a very simple book, how to do research with mixed methods and case studies and apply these concepts. So I do recommend that as a simple introduction if you're new to this. Currently, I'm writing a book on mixed methods, which is very exciting for me. It's really got some new stuff, like how your career could involve mixed methods, whilst your projects, actually, if they're very small, they can't involve mixed methods. But your learning does, right? And learning is all what epistemology is about. So today, I'm going to make an argument about epistemic relativism. I'm not just going to define it or say how it might be argued about in philosophy, but make a concrete argument of my own about it. And we've published this argument. Broadly, it goes under the heading of bridging into action. So if you have a firm commitment to some knowledge which you think is well grounded, then you're ready to act upon that knowledge. And I'd like to explain all the connections in that argument, really. So the first one is, what would your topic be for a piece of research? And how would anybody choose a topic? And what kind of topics get chosen? That's a really important question in science. We usually advise people to choose a topic that's a puzzle and then develop a well-focused research question in the area of that puzzle. But I would argue you also need to really push people and push yourself to be multidisciplinary. And so you're not just studying that topic in the old routine way of others who do the same thing. And so science would be innovative and would use evidence, but think about the evidence, reflect upon it. And in that reflection, we usually get into dialogues and multilogues, conversations. So this is very important as the grounding for how realists approach epistemology and knowledge. And it does become very sophisticated. So I'm going to give some examples, but I'm still concerned about what these topics are, because one possible argument is that they're not social, and so there isn't any relativism, because there would be hard knowledge about the objective truth of the stars or the truth of the whatever is the natural object. And I'm not sure there are very many topics in research that are non-social. So take, for example, veterinary medicine. Is it social or is it the natural sciences? You know, because if you could make a clear distinction between the two, then you might not need epistemological relativism for the veterinary science. But actually, veterinary science is partly about how veterinarians work and what kinds of things they think are appropriate to say or do. So veterinary science, you know, that's the science of working with animals. It has a big human component and it's very much social. And the same goes for experiments in medicine, which really should be conducted under the social model of health, and many other topics that you might think would be purely hard science. I mean, take, for example, nuclear. It sounds like it's a hard science in physics, but because of the applications of nuclear, it's highly social. So when you have a topic that has the social in it, then you have to start asking questions about who's doing the research, what are the standpoints of the researcher, and the researcher's theories. So theories arise in a historical context. So here's my questions, right? Think about your own topic. Is the research actually done by an elite? So is there a theory in the grounding of that research and its literature review that's actually a very elitist theory? And is it hiding the needs of masses of people who are not so literate? That's quite possible and very common. Colonizing societies, for example, have dominated through language, through setting up the episteme. So if you want to do post-colonial research, you're in a big challenge of how to overcome, or what, you just don't use the old episteme and you make your own episteme. There have been attempts like that, and that represents a form of epistemic relativism, where you say, well, there's that form of knowledge, but ours is going to be better. One example in India is called subaltern studies, And I'm not exploring it today, but I'm very aware that we have to realize about the colonial experience and the domination of whole cultures by other cultures, because that usually involves an elite form of knowledge in the, with epistemic norms. So then, is it being done by elders? Is it patriarchal? Is the research actually implicitly heteronormative? So, textbooks on veterinary medicine may use the he word for the doctors, and that implies that they expect all the doctors to be male, but in the modern world, that's not the case, and it's no longer appropriate. So I would say then that in summary from my little Q&A, good research is multi-voiced. And I want to talk now about multi-voice research and how it would operate. Actually, it means, for example, I may need to have interviews in my research process. And in interpreting the interviews, my voice will be part of the story. So an epistemic relativist would certainly want to have I or we, or both I and we in their articles. And the old tradition in hard science is usually that you wouldn't use I and you would have the passive voice. And there have been lengthy critiques of this disembodied godlike, we called it the God's eye view that we create if we use the passive voice in our writing. So my argument on epistemic relativism is that we should have I in the story, and yet that I should be quite a thoughtful, reflective person with conversations about my origins. So for example, mine is a, say, born in America origin, before that Scotland, these are really important things about how I interpret the world, but most of my research is in India. So I'd like to, if I may, turn to some PowerPoint slides, and that'll help, I think, with some of the terms used here. So I'd like to link multi-voice research with weak social constructivism, because it's very important not to go too far and say, well, because it's multi-voice research, therefore anything goes, anything can be true. There's a debate about truth in this recent literature, the last 30 years literature on multiple voices. And my view is that we shouldn't jump over to strong social constructivism. And there is quite a few philosophers who have written their opposition to strong social constructivism. And that does not rule out the argument that we're making, particularly me with Jamie Morgan, have tried to write out very carefully this weaker form of argument about weak social constructivism. And here you would say, for one thing, the meaning of things, the meaning of interviews, the meaning of maps depends on the intention of the speaker or the map maker. It also depends on social norms and traditions, habits, institutionalized practices, and stereotypes. And ontologically, I would distinguish all of those things that are on this slide. They're not the same. You can't run them all together. You have to be quite sophisticated. And when you get to resolving all these multiple voices and multiple meanings, you find dialectics. So when I came across dialectics, and I think I was in college, I was really impressed with it because it represented the social tensions, the multiple interpretations, and even elite social meanings. I learned to question what other people think that the crisis means, and to think, well, that crisis means many things. And the meaning of it to a banker is different from the meaning of it to a working class woman who's lost her job. That's what happened in my neighborhood. So if they have multiple meanings, multiple standpoints and viewpoints, how would we find truth within all that? So what I have done, and what I really try to, I just have to turn my slide, hold on. Mike, here we go, I'm sorry. I would like in this slide then to distinguish between the ideas of truth and falsehood, which there's a lot of debate about, and most people think epistemological debate is about truth and falsehood. But on the other hand, there's a different approach to knowledge where we say, no, we can make claims. They may lie in a gray area. We want them to seem to be warranted at the time we make them, but that doesn't necessarily make them true. And truth seems a kind of absolute, really, compared with my position of epistemic relativism. But at the same time, I would never want to make claims that are false. And if I know something is false, I must say that it's false. So the idea of the gray area is very important. And I don't agree with the statement that's written here in purple, that you may say nothing is true. Right? I don't agree with that statement. I agree with everything else that's written here. And in fact, you can end up saying that knowledge might underpin action. And action is, in human life, it's actually underpinned by knowledge. That's one of the things that distinguishes humans from animals, is that an animal doesn't reflect in the same way that a human does. you know, and we have self-consciousness and consciousness of the other. We have visceral awareness and we have awareness of the visceral feelings of others. And this has made us into an amazing species. So I think what we can have then is a weaker form of epistemic relativism, not throwing everything up to, you know, the impossibility of knowledge, but acknowledging social diversity, acknowledging difference, and the fact that there are various epistemes, there are various foundations for knowledge that are felt to be really important by different parts of the society. And these foundations are not agreeable to competing groups, so knowledge is essentially contested. But the fact that it's contested doesn't mean that there cannot be some claims which are actually false and some claims which are actually true with regard to some particular reality. Now, mathematics is an area where we can have knowledge which is true with regard to some reality. A deductive argument with a clear set of premises can have a clear, true conclusion. But in social research and in society, we're more often in this gray area. And we're trying to clear away the false representations and then argue about different possible theorizations in the gray area. So that's the argument that Jamie and I put. And it leads to the idea that action which has a reasoned basis is rational action and can be good action. It's not necessarily good, but at least it's reasoned. And rationality then has a very particular social meaning, that there has been a social conversation preceding the claim that an outcome or an action is rational. And this idea of the social rationality has been presented by many authors. I love Roy Basker's work, but also a fellow called Roth. He wrote a book that helps us to support mixed methods by this social rationality. And humans have a predilection to carry out this reasoning in a social environment, to have conversations. Fairclough is an excellent writer on discourses who says that one of the results of this is discursive intertextuality. So when I analyze data that's, say, interview data, or even the headings on a set of survey data, I consider them from multiple discourses. I'm able to absorb the fact that there are these different discourses in the society and then reach some conclusions about which ones are more and less helpful, which ones have falsehoods embedded in them. It's so exciting. So what have I got now? I've moved to the position where reasoned good actions are those which are meant to be good and meant to have good effects. And you may actually have some bad effects, but you learn from doing and have feedback loops. This is not pragmatism. This is so different from pragmatism. And for example, feminist economics aims for better gender relations, avoiding oppression and submissiveness. And they may have some short-term bad effects, but in the long term, good effects. This is not utilitarianism. So the reasoning includes an analysis of harm. Harm is real, harm is bad. By defining the essence of a harmful action as the fact that it could cause harm or did cause harm or may cause harm, or what we really say is under particular essentially definable circumstances would cause harm, then if we know what causes harm, then we try to avoid doing such harm. And in a way, that's all we need in order to have the good, is good action could arise from avoiding harm and do not act in harmful ways. And so it's almost like a gray area of action, that actions can be clearly bad or clearly good, or on the other hand, they may just be harmless in the middle. And actually changing discourses is a way of doing potentially good action in society, because we need discursive change in order to have change in society. So I want to finish soon. I do have a number of examples I can give. So I'm providing a PowerPoint set which people can use to look at my own research. I did not take the cultural term and become a sort of subjectivist. Instead, I've considered that culture is part of the grounding that makes every country unique. And unique means culturally specific with many cultures. And ironically, the DFID in the UK, it's the Ministry for Aid and International Development, they have adopted realism in the form of realist evaluation, because they agree with me, context matters. CMO means context, mechanism, outcome. And there's a book by Pawson and Tilley on that. So there are a lot of examples where methods have been affected by the findings of critical realism. And I think within that, it's really important that we're clear. Can I just summarize, right? I have a slide here on the 3 pillars, ontological realism, summarizing what is epistemic relativism. But the really key point here is that we're not saying that anything goes. we're saying reality is a grounding for claims that are useful and true, or at least not harmful, and for good action. So we need to interact with reality, do research to inform good action. For me, that meant then challenging utilitarianism, which in economics is widespread. So there's an example in the slides following, which I'm not going to go into just now. It's about qualitative findings from India and Bangladesh, and there are journal articles here which kind of sort of give the theorization of the approach to knowledge that's in our research. So I won't go through all the slides now, but welcome questions.
Wendy, thank you so much there. You really helped me anyway navigate my way through that grey space, challenging in a way what we take for granted, being clear about our reflexive role as researchers, as the thoughtful eye, as it were. And that encourages a kind of methodological modesty. One of the things about, I'm also very keen to pick up on what you say about epistemic relativism rather than epistemological relativism, and that's very helpful too. So one of the key things discussed in this area is fallibility, and the sort of, the fallibility of doing research. But also it seems to me really exciting because it holds the promise of changing understandings, of new ways of thinking. And with that in mind, I just wondered if you could give us one little example from, you didn't have time at the end, so do you want to just give one little example of that from your own work?
It wasn't that I didn't have time, it's kind of deliberate. I've put some empirical materials in slides so you can see where I do the research, the maps, and some bar charts. But the point I wanted to make was really about a bar chart. So when the survey researchers have a questionnaire and they summarize it in a bar chart, we're able to make these graphs. And many people think that they have to be true to the questionnaire to interpret that. Whereas I would say, from a realist point of view, we have to theorize the whole situation. We have to understand the history of that area. And that's a mixed history. There's very often wars, boundary debates, and we have to understand the multiple cultures of that area. And then when we get to it, we find that the bar chart represents the original questionnaire author's intended measurements and the respondents' concept of how they should respond to that. So it's what they think is an accurate or true response. But to interpret that is a completely different exercise in unpicking the meaning of those means in that bar chart. So the one we have in these slides is, there's one on the labor force participation of women, what percentage participate. It's completely obfuscated by national statistics. Whereas when we actually go and ask women what do they do, you get a very different picture. So the government's making bar charts and percentages, and they're just false. And the reality is that women overwork hours in India, Bangladesh, 10 hours a day. But the statistics show only 1/5 of women do any work at all in India, and that it's declining and they're avoiding the labor market. So how can there be those two, competing realities? Well, a realist has to reconcile them and realize that women's work is oppressed and invisibilized, and our job is to stop that invisibilization and appreciate it for what it is. That doesn't mean saying that they should work more. In fact, it means they need to do less work, but more of a balance in life. And the same for men. So you end up with a full position on gender, on patriarchy. And I've discovered, just to give you a further insight to how it leads to real change in your theoretical approach, I thought that there would be patriarchal norms in India and Bangladesh. I had thought that for several years working on this. But now I don't think that. And I think there's a patriarchal system. And a system is not the same as norms. The norms they have are about caring and conforming, and those are not necessarily patriarchal norms. They're shared norms about how men and women both should behave in a caring and conformist way. And it's a very specific situation in each region of this zone. And India has 1 billion people, so it has multiple regions. And I can't write it all up until I've understood some of those different regions. So yeah, like many people in development studies, I've become a bit knowledgeable on history and anthropology, and then you can write it up.